psychoanalysis and for the clinic. So what I actually prepared for us today, it's just a brief recap of what we actually seen last time. I'll just push this through rather quickly. Then I will just dive in to Alenka Zupancic's Reversal of Nothing, because in that text, she explores many of the elements which are crucial in order to give a proper discussion and actually to provide most of the fundamental elements to examine the uncanny and the uncanniness under pertinent terms to our current situation, speaking socially, but also if we manage to hear something fundamentally psychoanalytical about it. So I'll just present some elements from this text. Later on, I'll explore extimacy for Lacan, then push into contemporary suffering and experiences of indeterminacy in nowadays, the importance of understanding suffering which is recognized and suffering which is not recognized. And instead of just going with a study case, I decided to go with something else, which is presenting dispositive to which I'm actually participating from the beginning of its from its start. And I think it's actually very crucial, and it could spark some very important discussions on not only the uncanny, psychoanalysis, extimacy, and the position of the psychoanalyst, right? So this is what I have planned for today. So let's start with the quick recap, right? So last time around, we discussed Schellen's famous passage on the uncanny. We managed to investigate how this presents itself into Freud's text, and which is basically that which was supposed to be kept hidden, but then it reached the surface, or it actually came to light. So just a quick second, let me just close my door down here. Okay, so just excuse me for a bit. Some technical issues. Sorry about that, guys. Please forgive me. So where was I? Oh, yeah. So Schellen's famous passage on the uncanny, which inspired our discussion last time, something which was supposed to be kept hidden and then came to surface. And we realized that going back to Schellen's original text, it was actually dedicated to his late wife. So it has something to do with the presence of the dead for the living, which in itself is a very powerful symbolic discussion. It has many different implications. And this is something which, in a way, it will persist. In a radical way, if we understood the uncanny, we can actually see how this is actually one of the most important elements which derive from this discussion. There's something remarkably dialectical if we take a closer look at this. So we also took a closer look at Freud's formalization of the uncanny as a clinical operator, how it works, why, what does it stand for, and how it actually provides dignity to a lot of elements which were, in a way, not as quite clear as other experiences of suffering and symptoms. So this is one of the crucial elements that we need to pay attention to. There is also experiences of suffering which are recognized and those which are not. And this is something that we already talked a little bit about, but something that we will certainly take a closer look at this time. So we went through this last time. So Freud establishes the uncanny based around two different categories. The first one has everything to do with the uncanniness that we actually experience in our lives. Well, we can experience them both, but under different circumstances. The first one It's those that we experience in real life. And the second one, we could call it artificially, or we could call it from any aesthetical experience that we actually have. So those are the main elements of the uncanny which Freud investigates. The first one, it could be derived from two different roots: omnipotence of thought being the first one, and the second one, the one which derives from repressed childhood complexes. The second type basically just benefits from those prior mechanisms and collects on their consequences. So this is the best way to summarize the uncanny as presented by Freud. Why is this important? Basically, because it will allows us to take a closer look at the uncanny as something which, at the first level, confirms animistic beliefs that we thought to be subsumed, but then they reappear, right? So they confront material reality, they confront our experience of everyday life. And this doesn't necessarily cause us fear, but it actually causes surprise. So this first level fits to most of the examples that Freud himself experienced on the text, but there's also the second one. And the second one has a very clinical element, which is crucial for us to pay attention to, which is the uncanny derived from childhood complexes. Why? Because it happens when the return of the repressed re-encounters fantasies which do not depend on the proof of reality to cause fear, right? So they produce angst, anxiety, through, for example, the repetition of castration under different terms. And although you clash them against the proof of reality, they still persist. They cause fear nonetheless. So this is something that appears in the clinical context many different times. And it has a certain uncanny quality to it. So this is important for us to understand and to be able to listen to, instead of just diminishing as a smaller or insignificant element or trait on our clinics. This is something that we should provide dignity to. Why is that? Because its root has something crucial for the experience, for the subjective experience of suffering of that particular subject. So this is something that Freud emphasizes and that we most definitely should pay attention to. And the last one, which is the uncanny fiction, right? Which is when something that we experience in our own lives and something that we could perhaps consider in fiction just feel too close to one another, right? Or just barely differentiated from each other. And this causes a certain uncanniness that we experience reading books, watching films, seeing a play in the theater, and things like that. So those are actually pairs of oppositions, which are crucial for us to understand. This is already a commentary from another psychoanalyst, Christian Dunke. He examines the uncanny, and I think that it is helpful just to see possible pairs of oppositions which are somewhat connected to the uncanny, and that we can also be able to understand and see and provide dignity if this appears in our clinics, or when we're actually thinking about experiences related to this, right? So the uncanny has something to do with the familiar, the unfamiliar, home, homely, unhomely, trust, distrust, occult, and revealed, live, animate, dead, inanimate, and the thin, right? So those pairs of oppositions, those are crucial elements for us to take a closer look at. Why is that? Because not only they provide a certain uncanniness, they also tap into something that we discussed last time, which is something which is recognized and we provide dignity to, and something which is not recognized, thus just gets obliterated. It's not properly listened to. And in order to deal with suffering and subjective suffering and experiences that are not heard, those elements can help us out in terms of just realizing such operations, right? So, well, with that being said, I wanted to just introduce a couple of the elements that Alenka Zupancic describes and discusses in her text, Reverses of Nothing. The case of the, let me just get the full name because it's a very interesting name. Oh, I cannot seem to find it here, but it's down there. So the Reversals of Nothing, the case of the sneezing corpse. It's a very interesting essay, article. I don't know if those of you who are actually watching us or just here right now read it, but I would just introduce most of its elements because I think that they do help us out here, right, for this discussion. So Alenka will investigate not only the uncanny, but something about the uncanny and its relationship with comedy. Her investigation is that both the uncanny and comedy have or share a certain commonality, right? They both have something to do with nothing, in a way. So Alenka Zupancic, Slovenian philosopher, she actually wrote Why Psychoanalysis, What is Sex, The Odd One End. There are many books of her. I don't know if you heard of her or not, but she deals with these discussions, and I think that she actually gives us a very crucial formalization of the importance of this discussion, right? As she provides a very interesting way for us to investigate this element, the uncanny, right? So what she introduces to us is that instead of actually thinking of the uncanny, right, as something that that it's a nothing which appears as something, or something which will provide a symbolic sense of, or a rendering of nothing, for instance, the symbol zero, right? What she's actually paying attention to is that the experience of nothing, which the uncanny and comedy deal with, it's basically with the reminder of nothing, with nothing as insistent emerging in the real, while being deprived precisely of its symbolic support. So the most interesting element or part of this understanding is that there's something which appears or insists that it was not supposed to, right? But nonetheless, it's there. And this has something to do with both comedy and the uncanny, right? So Zupancic's investigation will lead to a certain spectrality, right? A material spectrality that we need to understand in order to investigate this commonality between what is funny and what is scary, between comedy and uncanny. So not only we can actually understand the reactions, there are objects that we can actually put close to one another, right? So I'm just going to read it. The point is that this kind of irreducible nothing is involved every time the comedy performs its trick of objectifying something seemingly immaterial or existing only in a differential relation to other things. She's going to deal with this materiality of the spectral, and I will present her example of the sneezing of the corpse, because I think that this is the best way of actually approaching this discussion, right? But it's basically how we can actually understand that something takes place at the same time between two opposite directions, right? So what scares us or something which is profoundly horrifying share a commonality with comedy, and nonetheless, they're completely opposites of one another. And this has something to do with different positions or different approaches to nothing. So she will actually examine this discussion, not only on this more abstract level, but also and foremost on the nature of the objects that they produce in order to play with, right? So those elements that we actually identify as uncanny, they do share something with something which is comic or something which is also funny, right? In order to do so, she will bring Octaves Manoni's discussion on the theatrical illusion, right? The theatrical illusion, it's basically when you go out, this is an example from Octaves Manoni here, right? And I'll go back to this one later on. It's basically when you go out to see a play and everything's just going fine. You're watching the actors performing, no news. But then one of the characters needs to die on stage, right? So his dad laying down on the ground, but there's just too much dust on the floor. And then all of a sudden, during the middle of the performance, imagine that the actor who was supposed to be dead, right? He's playing somebody who is actually dead on the ground. All of a sudden he sneezes, right? And instead of actually understanding what will be the reaction of the audience, right? Of like, oh, people should be terrified. The person, no one will necessarily be scared of that. Not at all. People will just burst into laughter. People would just laugh of a situation such as this. Why is that? Because this theatrical illusion has something to do, and this is one of the elements that we need to understand in order to adequately categorize the distinction between the uncanny and comedy, right? Which are actually the different relationships which are established between the subject and the big other, which take place in situations such as this, right? So let me just go back here. This is actually part of a longer discussion, which Zupancic was inspired by Robert Fowler's article, which is present on a book Slavoj Žižek edited, called Silent Partners from 2005, I guess. And this is actually, a text that she basically authored or responded to Robert Fowler's discussion on Manoni. So there are 4 elements which Robert Fowler find that will provide more dignity to why is this experience somehow uncanny? What is actually taking place, right? So he will name 4 different categories. First one is the advent of symbolic causality, something that starts as a play or pretense takes the upper hand and starts functioning in the real. So this would be one of its elements. The second one is the success. Not only that everything succeeds, it even succeeds just too much, more than intended. And repetition and the figure of the double, right? So those are 4 elements which he investigates. And Zupancic will actually say that there's actually a bit more to it, right? That she agrees with Fowler, but she provides a Lacanian render of the discussion, which deals with 2 crucial distinctions that we'll discuss later on, okay? So taking a closer look at the sneezing corpse and the theatrical illusion, one of the points that Manoni defends is that what is actually taking place here is fetishist disavowal, right? Or the delegation of belief, right, to a certain big other. Basically, what happens is the following. Imagine that you are actually participating in this situation, right? So you are at that particular theater, you are watching that play, you're sitting there, everything's cool, and then you witness something like that. You probably laugh at the situation. And why is that? Because you established a possibility of delegating your own knowledge to actually enjoy the play, right? So it's almost as if you displaced your knowledge, you delegated to the big other, and you know that there is a certain guarantee and nothing's actually happening right there, right? At that scene, you know they're just staging a play. It is because you understand that this can actually be something you enjoy. Manani will say that this only works because you delegated this knowledge to the big other, but because there is this abstract, this virtual big other, which is actually ignorant that this could actually just be something or just an action being staged, something which is just being performed. So it's because there is this abstract big other, or there is this element of someone who could actually be fooled by what is actually going on. Is that the reason why you actually feel this is funny? But both Alenka and Fowler will actually disagree on this understanding, right? They will just say there's more to it. There's more going on than just the fetishist disavowal taking place. And one of the crucial elements that Zupancic will point out concerns the real and the notion of nothing between comedy and the uncanny, which will actually provide that there's more than just this cognitive mistake taking place. So she will dive right into this discussion. So the overall idea that we know better and to believe in what we are seeing, right? It plays only half of what is basically taking place in this scenario, right? Although this taps into this animistic argument that we discussed last time, there's also something more, right? When we are dealing with the theatrical illusion. Why is that? Because something that we are actually witnessing on the theatrical play or the illusion, right? It will stay later on, right? So when you watch a play, after you saw the whole performance, there's something which will persist, although it's like close the curtains, it's done, and you will bring something out of it, right? You will be somewhat affected by that very own experience. This is one of the crucial elements that we need to actually take into consideration, right? There is a distinction here between reality and the real. And this is one of the key elements that Zupancic is introducing here, right? Instead of just considering or realizing the real as something which it's unveiled or revealed, and it's somehow deceiving reality, what she argues in under Lacanian terms is that it's something to be constructed, which is different from being represented or imitated, right? So she will say that there's something about this experience that can actually build, can be constructed. And this certain dimension, it's different than just this element of delegating knowledge, right? So I also mentioned something about the role of the big other against this situation. And this is actually crucial for us to understand the differences between comedy and the uncanny. Basically because when we are dealing, right, with the uncanny, one of the things that we usually find people defending is actually the risk of confusing reality with the real. And this is basically to say the risk of reality running crazy, right? So this could be a very interesting definition of the uncanny as Zupancic will defend. Why is that? Because basically, when the big other fails to provide consistency, right? He fails to actually sustain this ground to mediate the subject's experience. This anxiety, right, could be a bit too much. And it is at that stage where reality can confuse with the real, things can actually become terrifying, scary, and so on. So the crucial example of the theatrical play is that there are effects of the real which are at stake, right? You can tap into the play, tap back into reality, and something will actually persist. You can actually enjoy something out of this presentation, and something will continue with you, right? It's not that you just delegated knowledge itself, but you can actually delegate elements of it. Nonetheless, when you go back, something will not only stay with you, but something can actually be transformative. So it's deeper in a sense, right? So this is something crucial that she defends, the Zupancic, which is there's something about a certain frame that can be constructed. And this framing will provide the possibilities or the conditions of possibility of a transformative experience for the subject. So with that being said, I would just read this part. I think it's a very important passage. Sorry for that, I do apologize. But what could strike us as uncanny, for example, is if at the end of the play, the actor playing the corpse did not stand up to receive the applause with the other actors, but were to remain laying dead on the floor. This would imply precisely that the big other is supposed to know how things stand in reality, and to guarantee that they remain standing as they do, no longer holds this knowledge and this guarantee for the subject. In other words, it would imply that our own better knowledge of the fact that this is only a play we're watching is left without the support of the other. And this is certainly something which is profoundly uncanny, right? This is a crucial configuration of this invasion, right, of the real, or something that somehow persisted, insisted, right? These seconds, these moments will make you question what is actually going on at that stage, right? So it's when this experience takes place, what you are actually going through is uncanniness, right? So this is a very typical configuration of the uncanny. It's this nightmarish feeling when the subject is alone in seeing that there's something wrong with what is happening, with no big other to support her knowledge or experience and to make it transmissible to others. In the uncanny, the emergence of the impossible real object in the field of the big other always involves this radical severance of the subject from the other. This is another crucial element that we need to consider here, right? Last time we discussed that experiences of solitude, experiences of nocturnal, frightening elements, and this uncanny element which can actually appear in these moments have everything to do with this kind of abandonment, this kind of collapse of the big other, right? Which leaves you without no safe net to what you're actually going through. So in a way, this is the uncanny element of it. But then Zupancic will actually go to another discussion, which is the comic feeling that could actually appear in a situation such as this, right? And she will actually explain that we could perhaps just see the actor just running along with his knees, right? Perhaps imagine that another actor, which is also there at the stage at that particular scene, and he listens to the other actor sneezing, right? And he says something like, "Bless you," right? So he plays with it. This is a very good example of that too muchness, which can be certainly funny, right? And you just see, okay, that's interesting, right? I'm saying, imagining, and immediately just smiling about it because it's very funny in a way, right? But that's the thing. So there's a certain commonality and a certain circuit of nothing which will revolve between those two elements, the comedy and the uncanny, right? So this example of the sneeze as an object will actually be crucial for us to understand this difference here, right? Good. So let me just go ahead because I think that I already talked a lot about this. Yeah. So when we're talking or dealing, right, with what is at stake for both comedy and the uncanny, has to do with nothing. If we dig a little deeper, we can actually understand that there is a certain experience of negativity, which exists and functions as a condition of differentiality within our symbolic and imaginary world, right? It's readability. And this is crucial because this is actually one of the key points that will help us understand the difference between Lacan's understanding of the uncanny from Freud's understanding of the uncanny. Not because Lacan is against Freud's argument, but because he actually takes another element to it. He adds to it. He supplements it in a certain kind of way, which for us is crucial in order to not only understand anxiety, but the more paradoxical element which is at stake with the uncanny, right? So the Constitution, I think that this is actually pretty important. So this is why I'm actually reading. So according to Lacan, the constitution of reality presupposes an element falling off of it, supporting, through its very lack, the consistency of a given reality, right? So there's something which structures the way that we deal with reality itself. And it has everything to do with this element which is falling out. And this is why this constitutive lack gets established for the subject, and the subject will pursue something to deal with this, symbolically trying to deal with this, on and on. So this operation of castration, or this operation which takes place, is something that can be, or it's actually one of the key elements for the uncanny, but there's more to it, as we will actually see, right? So at the level of the spectral materiality, comic objects and uncanny objects share a commonality, right? But it's actually different. Is that when we're dealing with the uncanny, when we're dealing with anxiety, what appears is the lack comes to lack, which is a formula coined by Lacan to defend why anxiety has an object, right? Which is object petital, which is object A, right? So the constitutive lack, which precisely as a lack supports our symbolic universe, and its differentiations comes to be lacking. What emerges in its place is an impossible surplus object that has no place in given reality and blatantly contradicts its laws. To a certain extent, Lacan's formula also applies to the comical. So this is crucial for us to understand, right? So the mechanisms of lack have something to do with both the uncanny and with comedy. So they share this common ground. And it is the way that we actually deal with this that will provide us a more nuanced understanding of the logic behind the uncanny. So the example that Zupancic will investigate is a important one, basically because it's something that we can actually find in Freud's discussion of Hoffman's text, Hoffman's novel, The Sandman, which it's basically the possibility or the fear of having your eyes being plucked out. Nathaniel's fear, if you remember the text, he was just terrified over this. this is one of the points that Freud will associate this fear with fear of castration, right? And introduce many elements inspired by Otto Hunk's discussion on the doppelganger, the double, and it will basically go back to this. And Zupanchit's investigation here is very fascinating, because what she actually does is to invert, but it's usually the common approach that we find out there, right? Usually you will find those two arguments. Why, right? I mean, what is so ghastly, what is so horrifying or troubling in that particular experience? The first argument is that instead of the eyes, two empty holes yawn in the person's face. And second is that eyes themselves, once detached from the body, they appear as ghastly, right? Impossible objects, just eyes lying around, right? So fascinating, makes perfect sense, right? You see that object, which it's occupying a position which was not supposed to be occupying, and also something which we usually imaginarily see in a certain totality, or used to see in a certain totality, all of a sudden appear lacking, right? So, and this is crucial. I'll read this passage because it's very, very important. So, open quote, namely that instead of the eyes, which on the imaginary level always suggests an indefinite depth, an opening into a possibly inscrutable, bottomless dimension of subjectivity, eyes being considered as, open quote, openings into person soul, end quote. The holes instead of the eyes are all too shallow, all too finite, their bottom all too visible and close. So that, once again, what is horrifying, it's not simply the appearance or disclosure of a lack, but rather that the lack comes to lack, that this lack itself is removed, that it loses its support. So that's actually very fascinating. So instead of actually noticing that the problem is basically that it has some additional element which gets added to this discussion, it's pretty much the other way around, right? So the subject loses the very support that her desire and broadly her support symbolic universe had in a constitutive lack. This means that what it was supposed to be operating, a mechanism which was supposed to be taking place, starts to fail. It's not operating as such. And this is actually very uncanny. This causes a very singular experience of anxiety, right? And in this particular reversal that she actually introduces concerning someone's eyes being plucked out, it's basically because it's all too shallow, right? It's almost as if everything else that it was supposed to be operating in that particular moment, that reinscription of the symbolic and the imaginary, that symbolic economy of what is minus, of what is plus, of what it lacks, and its complement, it's all gone, right? And this disturbance, this symbolic economical disturbance, is completely connected to the experiences of the uncanny. So moving forward, and this is where Lacan will add to this discussion of anxiety and introduce something different to what it was Freud's key argument, right? So, like I said just a couple of minutes ago, it's not that Lacan is not agreeing with Freud's discussion of the castration complex. Certainly, it's not about that, but it's that there's something else, something more fundamental. There's an original lack right? A lack in the real. So this structural flaw inscribed in the being in the world of the subject that we are actually dealing with here. And this is precisely how Lacan will perhaps introduce something fundamentally crucial to this debate. So the castration complex, it works as a pivotal point to our experience because it provides a symbolic rendering, basically a symbolic support, right? So, and hence a way of dealing with what? The transposing the lack in the real. So it operates, right? So it is there for a reason. Castration operates for a reason for the subject. But it's actually a problem, and this is crucial, right? So his claim is that at the bottom of anxiety, there is not a revived fear or menace of castration, but a fear of a menace of losing the castration itself. That is to say, of losing the symbolic support of the lack, the symbolic support provided by the castration complex. So this particular transformation, which Lacan's is integrating here, it tells us something about the paradoxical inherent construction, not only of the uncanny, which inspires this entire discussion, but also it provides us with more dignity to the importance of the uncanny itself. Not, of course, for the clinical discussion that we are having, but also about the importance of that which is not symbolically recognized and the impacts which this actually can introduce to the experience of suffering of the subject. What I'm basically just trying to say is that once this operation of castration, which plays a function, is also removed from the subject's experience, that function will basically cause anxiety. Why? Because the operation of the big other, which was supposed to be guaranteeing something for that subject, is now gone. So even though this holds a certain imaginary level for this configuration for the subject, yes, the big other it lacks, of course, it's barred, but nonetheless, you count to it, right? There's an operation of as if, which holds this together to a certain extent. Because when it does lack, it's basically anxiety that the subject feels. And this can also be experienced or perceived through uncanniness. Going back to Alenka's text, so the realism of desire, and she will counterpose with the realism of the drive. So desire is to the side of the uncanny, while the realism of the drive is to the side of comedy. And this is, I'll just read it because I think it's crucial and it's very, it's crystal clear in a way, right? So the uncanny relies entirely on the structure of desire, based on the antinomy of the object of desire and its transcendent cause. The cause of desire is the originally lost subject, the loss of which opens up the scene on which all possible objects of desire appear. The object cause of desire is constitutively excluded from the field of desire and its objects, that is to say, from the begotter. This absolute disjunction of the real object and reality constituted through the begotter is fundamental for the possibility of the uncanny. If the object cause emerges on the level of the begotter instead of being present as absent, it produces the uncanny. So there is a certain operation that takes place when we're dealing with the uncanny, right? And I think that one of the crucial examples that we should consider here, it's Freud's walking around the piazza in Italy, right? Which is the example that I used last time, but it fits perfectly here. But I will talk a little bit more about it. Let me just go through Alenka's explanation here, right? So we're talking about this constitutive lack, right? And in a way, the uncanny is based upon and exploits the realism of desire, the emergence of that, but ought to have remained secret and hidden, right? But induces a collapse of reality. In a way, a desire cannot desire the real that makes it desire. Yet it is also tempted to fantasize about it, embracing this cause in a self-destructive over-realization. That is to say, precisely the over-realization that we encounter in the uncanny. It is an over-realization with which we pass over to the other side, which is not the case with surplus realization in the comical, right? So there's something which is profoundly crucial for this experience of lack of the subject, which causes him to try to find other objects and puts himself forward towards those different objects, but which cannot, he's tempted to fantasize it, right? But he's not basically able to over-realize this, right? He cannot do this because if he does so, the experience of this over-realization is uncanny, right? So this is a crucial element that we just need to consider here. And I brought back the example of Freud because I think it's a very interesting one just to illustrate how something which can be profoundly uncanny, it is also comic, right? So remember that last time we talked about Freud walking around in that piazza in Italy, and all of a sudden he realizes he's actually close to a brothel. So he realizes that, gets somewhat bothered by it. So he just like, he just tries to run away from that block. So he's walking around this little red district. He just makes a left, makes another left, and all of a sudden he ended up in the same place, right? And that for him is something remarkably uncanny. And although we could realize or just understand this as a very uncanny experience, right? Something which we could perhaps deem to be weird at some levels, it is very funny, right? It's also quite entertaining in a way, because that particular thing that he was actually trying to avoid or run away from, it's precisely what he ended up finding, right? So that's a very interesting element for us to consider when we're dealing with the uncanny. And I think that many experiences that we debate, hear, and listen in our own clinics or in our experiences have much to do with this realism of desire, right? So, of course, Freud does not go in depth on something about desire or even sexuality at this particular example that he coins, and he actually lived. But it's a very fascinating element if we just stop to consider, right? There's a certain element of desire taking place. So let me just switch off and move towards our next element of today's discussion, which is extimacy, right? So although I don't know, for me at least, right? We seem to be talking more and more about extimacy in Lacan. And it's a very fascinating thing, mostly because Lacan talks about extimacy basically 4 times throughout his entire teaching. So, which is very different from the Uncanny, which appears throughout his entire teachings from basically seminar 3 to all the way up to 24. Le inquiétant étrangeté, right? The uncanny and how this participates in depth on seminar 10, as we also previously discussed. And when we were talking about extimacy, it appears on seminar 7, seminar 9, and twice at seminar 16. And it's a very particular element, right? So it's a neologism. He coined that, and it has everything to do with combining intimacy and so what is intimate and what is external, right? So extimacy is this combination that blurs things about what it was supposed to be intimate and that which was supposed to be external. It's basically participating within itself, the intimate exteriority, this extimacy. And why is this crucial, right? So we were discussing about basically elements of the desire. And it is in seminar 7 that he talks about the ethics of desire, and he will articulate with the subject of the unconscious and introduce something about those blurred lines between what it was actually supposed to be, what it was actually a psychic internal element, right, and something which was deemed to be external. And Lacan, ever since seminar 1, already defends how this is not quite the case, right? So I will remind you also of the scheme L that we also investigated last time, just to make this argument. And I think this will allows us to go in depth about this. And there's also one other crucial element that at the very end of seminar 9, he will also discuss the extimacy, introduces something about identification, the dimension of identification, designating a continuity between inside and the outside for the subject, introducing a dialectical element oriented to the begotter. So that operation of the begotter, and there's something about those blur lines between inside and outside for the subject, and it has everything to do with desire, right? So it participates in there. Another very important element or aspect about ximacy, it implicates that it's more external of the begotter is actually the most internal aspect of the subject. And I think that this is one of the final designations that Lacan develops on this neologism. And it's a very interesting way of just noticing that the desire is desire of the begotter, this relationship which gets established for the subject, the relationship between the subject and the begotter participates in many different layers. And the uncanny, it's a crucial element in order to actually understand and to hear what are the identificatory traits which participate in such dimension, right? So it's almost as if there's a certain threshold of the dialectic of pleasure which operates around this forbidden core, right? So there's something in there which is too intense to embrace, right? And I think that going back to that final passage from Zupanchic's article, it becomes clear what we're actually addressing here, and also this dimension of object A that participates to the uncanny and also to the logic of anxiety. So yeah, but moving on, just a couple of crucial elements that we just need to understand to take a closer look at ximacy, right? So if we understand the unconscious is a structure like a language, so there's always this element of the begotter participating there. Desire is the desire of the other, and the signifier represents the subject for another signifier. I know those are big statements from Lacan, overused, The other idea is not to just reinforce them ideologically, but it's actually to destabilize them in a certain kind of way. Why? Because if we understand them, we also understand that they are always introduced in a certain movement, right? They are not fixed positions. It's actually a relationship between the barred subject and the begotter. It's something that we always need to take into consideration instead of just satisfying ourselves with this overly psychological assumptions of the interior and the exterior. And this is actually something crucial for Lacan on his 16th seminar, right? From the begotter to small other. And I think that if we understood this operation, we can actually take a closer look at many different elements that extimacy allows us to hear that are usually ignored. This is a passage from Slavoj Žižek, and I think that it summarizes what I'm actually just trying to defend here. I'll read them. So open quote, object is definitely external to subject, but it is also more radically external to the very space within which the subject can distinguish itself from reality out there. Maybe we can apply here Lacan's neologism, extimate. The object is so thoroughly internal to the subject that this very over-intimacy makes it external, uncanny, inadmissible. For this reason, the status of the object with regard to the pleasure principle is profoundly ambiguous. It is repulsive, provoking horror and disgust, but at the same time, exerting an irresistible fascination and attracting our gaze to its very horror. Open quote, one thus understands why so many victims of the object are its fascinated victims, if not its submissive and willing ones. End quote. Such a mixture of horror and pleasure points towards a domain beyond the pleasure principle, the domain of jouissance. One does not know it, one does not desire it, one enjoys it violently and painfully, a passion, end quote. So if we understood that there is something which is profoundly within the subject, that which is more radically within, internal to the subject, it's actually something which is profoundly external. We can understand that most of those difficult elements that we find in our experiences in life and conversations, but of course in our clinics, has everything to do with facing that which the subject just don't want to get in touch with, do not want to get involved with, that which he just simply does not want to face, right? So there's something in there which just shouldn't be there for the subject, right? It's inadmissible. And I think the term is very, very crucial here. It's very precise. And this element is what actually pushes or just drives the crucial importance of extimacy for the clinic. But also, in order to understand that there is something quite radical of alterity, of otherness, which takes place once we realize this particular operation. So in a way, what the notion of extimacy does is to provide an operator inspired by the uncanny, right? Not away from it or deriving from it, that allows us to introduce that this clash that the subject feels when he is dealing with something which he does not want to deal with, it has something very profound about the subject himself. So it is because of this particular point that we need to actually find and develop the tools of actually listening to extimacy in operations within the clinic, because those are crucial elements to go against the resistance of the analyst, right? The resistance is always to the side of the analyst. What does this mean? This means that if the subject's not being heard, it's basically because the analyst is not being able to listen to something which the subject is actually introducing about his own experience, about his own suffering. The crucial operation of extimacy is that once the subject is still with something that is very inadmissible to himself, the analyst must not resist, right? The analyst must be able to listen to this and understand that there is something formidably crucial in this particular experience of suffering that the subject is going through. There are just 2 points that I wanted to bring, and I think those are very crucial elements. The first one, it has something to do with an article from a Brazilian philosopher called Vladimir Safatli. And I think it's quite crucial because his understanding of the psychoanalytic dispositive introduces a dimension of transference and a dimension of the psychoanalytic process itself as crucial to deal with that which is or can be experiences of mastery over the subject, experiences of I can't seem to find the term here, but well, mastery could be a good one, right? So the suffering which derives from this mastery, the subject suffers from, he can actually deal with this through an analysis. He can transform that particular experience, right? How? So first of all, he needs to deposit through transference something to the analyst, right? Who is supposed to know something about that particular experience of suffering. And there's something quite revolutionary. I'm using the terms that he uses in this particular article, but something which can be quite transformative in the sense. And why is that? Because those identificatory traits of dominance, of abuse or violence, mastery over the subject can be addressed in such manner that he can find through the process of an analysis means to introduce a certain of Hebel into it, right? He can subsume such elements and transform his subjective experience, re-signifying those. He can actually find ways to do that through an analysis. And mostly because an analytic procedure, it's meant to be subsumed, right? The process itself, right? You have to find a way to actually also get rid of the analyst throughout this process itself, right? So you liquidate the transference through the variant process. And by doing so, you find ways to also get rid of those traits which causes suffering, subjective suffering. With that being said, and I think that this summarizes the importance or the most transformative element which psychoanalysis can actually introduce to the subject, there is also a dimension of contemporary suffering and the experiences of indeterminacy nowadays, which is also inspired by a book from Christian Dunker, and basically has something to do with, and this goes back to our discussion of the Uncanny, of course, right? Which is those who are recognized and have a position or an ability to find symbolic means to deal with their suffering, and those who don't. So the possibility or the capability of recognizing symbolically on suffering and the position of those who don't always comes with a certain element of violence, right? There is always a barrier between those two positions. Contemporary suffering has everything to do with this experience, right? And in a certain kind of way, we dealt with the private and the public as the Uncanny tends to do. And determinacy and indeterminacy also have something to do with this capabilities and dispositions, right? So what we're trying to defend is that the position of those who are excluded from a symbolical capability of dealing with experiences of suffering usually could benefit from something that psychoanalysis can provide to them, not only on a personal level, but also when we're actually building our evaluations to experiences that reinforce situations such as this, right? So when we're actually thinking about like capitalism, and we're thinking about neoliberalism, and we're thinking about exploitation and all the different new forms to perfect such operations, what we're dealing with, it's the worsening of this particular experience of indeterminacy, subjective indeterminacy, which derives from this material experience for the subject. So in a way, the uncanny is very crucial. Why? Because he's always paradoxically dealing with what is in and what is out. So it is because of this particular operator that we can understand that the extimacy has a different room, not only for analysis, but also when we're actually sitting at the position of the analyst, right? And we're actually understanding psychoanalysis itself. So I'm about to go to the end of my presentation today. I just wanted to introduce this dispositive, which takes place at the east outskirts of São Paulo, Brazil. It has 7 months of existence, right? So it's a fairly new dispositive on União de Vila Nova, which is the place of the neighborhood where this happens, the community where this happens. The name that we decided collectively for it, it's Favela of Psychoanalysis. It's a psychoanalytic dispositive that it was meant to be able to operate within that local demands that appear for psychoanalysis, and it has everything to do with providing the dignity for the suffering which is produced and to the reality of the community down there. I decided to actually introduce this dispositive instead of just presenting a study case because I think it's crucial for our discussion here, and it gives a political edge to the discussion of extimacy on one side, but it also introduces a certain aesthetical political perspective to the uncanniness, which is crucial when we're dealing with the suffering that surfaces from those who are excluded, right? So this is a very crucial discussion that for us we need to have, right? So of course there are particular demands that have everything to do with the place, but what I'm actually bringing here today for us to discuss and to think about, it concerns the fact that the position of the dispositive itself is interesting, right? Because it's not only about the psychoanalytic treatment of the suffering, right? It has something to do with the possibility of thinking about the psychoanalytical tripod, right? Of the formation of the analyst, the supervision of the analyst, and his own personal analysis, right? And to introduce how this dispositive is actually trying to do something about this tripod under different terms, right? instead of actually perpetuating and fetishizing poverty, right? It's actually providing the means of analysis for those who are actually coming from the community, right? It's actually doing it instead of just like preaching about it, right? Instead of just like trying to transform this as a new ideological position, just to brag about or write articles about it. It's actually a practice which takes place there. So this is actually a fundamental element which takes place in this dispositive that we are actually building. It's a collective effort, of course, right? I'm just one of its participants, but nonetheless, I think it's a very potent dispositive which takes place, and it provides something very fascinating for the psychoanalytic discourse, right? Because not only provides a certain dignity to it, but it goes against the elitism of psychoanalysis itself. And I think that this is a crucial element of extimacy that we also should be able to just understand and to deal when we're basically discussing psychoanalysis, right? So what is very interesting about this dispositive is that it deals in a collective. So in a certain kind of way, it's almost like a kraken, right? It has many different tentacles, many different collectives which operate down there in order to make this work, right? So it's not only about this psychoanalytic invention, right? Which is being conducted down there, but there's also just collective kitchens. There's also, oh my goodness, I completely forgot, a collective farm. Maybe I'm sorry, bad English here. I completely forgot about the term, but there are many collective efforts that compose this local experience, right? So this possibility of developing collectiveness, it's a crucial element to provide dignity to the experience of the subjects who deal or have to deal with not being recognized, right? Not finding the possibility of being recognized, who are actually crystallized under certain signifiers. And the overall importance of extimacy, in a way, is to manage to operate this in a certain kind of way that this centers this experience and provides a certain dignity to the subjective suffering that is in place there, right? I'm personally building a new part of this collective, which is dedicated to a vast part of the male population who got out of jail, right? Got out of prison and have no possibility of finding work or dealing with this experience of suffering, which just perpetuates the symbolic experience of being in prison. So this is actually one of the elements which I'm developing down there. And this is basically why I think that both the Uncanny and its articulation within extimacy can actually provide something, create something new in terms of re-subjectivization and also towards the creation of new signifiers, especially in situations where subjects went through this violence against the state, which is basically experimented in many different layers, right? So in a way, if we understand those operators, we can actually not only listen to this particular experience or singular experience of suffering, but we can also provide different routes and alternatives to create something else. So this is basically what I have prepared for today. I wanted to thank you all for your patience, and I hope this was a very productive and Interesting conversation to all of you. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Okay, nice work, Rodrigo. That was excellent. I want to invite folks to jump in with questions. I could maybe start, if that's okay. Can you say a little bit more regarding the theme of recognition and suffering and how it intersects with the operation of the uncanny? It's interesting to me because there is a left-wing Marxist reading of Hegel, which insists that Hegelian recognition is not the best way to understand the dialectic. And so I think, oftentimes when Marxists want to put forward a political theory or a political philosophy, which would try to center recognition, it's not something that's common. It doesn't occur very much, in part because what is based on the efficacy of recognition is actually not a revolutionary gesture. Because what recognition is about is the status quo of the institutions and what they're capable of performing. And I think also that Marx's proletariat is never going to receive adequate recognition. It's never going to be a achievement, right? In fact, therefore, one should resist that. Now, that's Marxism. However, psychoanalysis and even Lacan also, from a different angle, puts under suspicion the category of recognition. I would say, in the sense that through his critique of the imaginary, and also through his critique of ideals. And so when you're dealing with lumpen proletariat subjects that have been discarded from the socio-symbolic entirely, I've always thought to myself, and that category of people in the United States are of great sociological interest to me, but I've always thought that it's never as straightforward as to say that, and I know you're not saying this is why I want to invite you more to say it, but I think in a kind of cartoonish way, we sometimes think that their suffering is related to a form of a lack of recognition because they desire, we almost project what we as, I don't know, professionals or educated people, I guess you could say, people, let's say, people engaged in the battle of recognition. We are those such people. The category of people you're talking about are not, but because they're not, doesn't that mean that their desire is not to be made analogous to ours, right? So the question of recognition is not necessarily, therefore, one that's the cause of the anguish of their subjective condition. I wonder if you agree with that, because that would then presuppose that they desire to be a part of the system or of the institutional fabric, when in some cases that's actually not where the desire is actually for subjects that are not included. You see my point? So the whole relationship between inclusion, exclusion is complex. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Oh, thank you so very much, Daniel. That's actually a very fascinating comment. And first of all, yes, I completely agree with you on that. But there's a certain psychoanalytic attitude, which I think it's crucial here, right? You don't presuppose that you actually know what guides one's desire, right, in advance. You don't know it a priori, right? You don't know what it means. What you understand is that there is something which is not automatically recognizable. You can actually understand that there are positions. You don't know how they actually take place. You don't know how they actually operate, right? So this is why dealing even with like the Hegelian discussion in the sense of the bubble, what is it called in English? Sorry for that. Rubble, perhaps? Hegel's rubble,
Right.
right? This is why it's so interesting, right? Or even the proletariat under Marxist terms.
Yeah.
You cannot essentialize it, right? You cannot just coin it, because if you do so, you actually lose the potency of what it actually means, right? If you just embody the revolutionary subject, right? It's the best way of actually never achieving that particular revolution. Why is that? Because people fall in love with themselves in a certain kind of way, right? And they get caught into the dimension of ideals, right? Which will never work. So I think that the crucial element here is to understand that those are moving operators, right? They're not fixed or ossified, crystallized. Those are just positions that are always moving. And I think that there is something which is fairly open to what Lacan's actually suggesting. And I think that if we, instead of just introducing perhaps a less orthodox perspective on Marx, can actually learn something from it, right? Not because we deem to know what the other wants, right? But because we don't presuppose that we do in advance, but we actually make somehow room for it to appear, right? We provide certain conditions in order for it to appear. And I think that there is something that can be fairly productive here. And I think that there is also a very crucial element of your commentary, Daniel, which is quite fascinating, right? Which is, are we dealing with a reform instead of something revolutionary, right? So making room, accommodating people to be recognized and so on and so forth. Is this just a way of getting rid of something revolutionary? In a certain kind of way, I do understand this argument, this line of thinking, but on the other hand, I think it's very difficult when we're dealing with extreme poverty, right? And the impoverishment of people, right? So I think that they would just love to have a decent meal at the end of the day, right? I mean, we're literally talking about radical, riff-raff structural poverty here, right? So it's very easy to actually, count with the revolution, for those who are actually starving. And I think that there is something crucial here that we should not just pretend that we are going to do, right? And I think that this is actually a very, very significant element that I think that we should all take into consideration here, right? And more interesting than that, let's go back to the more philosophical level of the discussion, right? Think about the cunning of reason, Hegel's cunning of reason, right? Think about when Haitian Revolution took place, right? What we saw were basically Haitians singing the Marseillaise to the French, right? This is where those ideals actually were realized. That's the revolution of it. It's not so much about the French people, right? But when we saw that cunning of reason taking place down there. Why I'm bringing this up is basically because we never know when the revolutionary subject will take place. It's almost like the Bajurian discussion of the fidelity to the event, right? You never know. There's a certain indecidability of the event. You never know when a revolution will take place, right? So instead of just like sitting down, laying around, waiting for the revolution to take place, right? You can actually persist in this fidelity in a certain kind of way. But there are people who are actually starving. So I think it's a very distasteful kind of approach just to ignore material conditions when we're just waiting for the revolution to take place, right? We need to do something in a certain kind of way. And I think that there is a crucial practice taking place in experiences such as this, right? And I think that they can actually reintroduce subjective suffering in many different ways, can actually produce alternatives which are not thought of, basically because people do not participate in those things, right? And do not participate in a very serious fashion, right? This is why it's so crucial or important to conceive dispositives such as this. It's basically what you would see in any other school of psychoanalysis, but it's inside the favela with very like interesting discussions, and people can actually get out of there and just assume themselves the position of an analyst if they want to do so, and so on. Why can't we think of that? Why so preposterous to think of that, you know? And I think that this, in a certain kind of way, especially for psychoanalysis, is revolutionary. Basically because it's not elitist at all. It tries to attempt to something which is very, very creative. And I don't see this happening in many other places, right? I mean, we do have your dispositive taking place, which is very fascinating, but it's a rare attempt, right? And I think that why this movement is so important in a certain kind of way. But I think your question is quite important here. And my way of trying to respond to that, it would go towards this direction, right? Instead of presupposing that we know what the other wants, the overall idea of hearing extimacy is that you don't. But people think, right? Let's go to Sivan Lazarus, which you also appreciate as much as I do, right? People think. And the condition of thinkability of the other cannot be presupposed, right? It cannot be an heterogeneous experience that you put on top of someone else's head. But if you allow the possibility, the condition of possibility to that otherness to also participate into that, you can create something completely new. And I think that there is a bet towards that. So it's a bet towards this possibility, I would say. But you just introduced me a very difficult question, Daniel.
No, it's good.
Oh God, that was a tough one.
No, it's very interesting. I want to invite others to jump in with comments and or questions.
Yeah, how's everybody doing? I'll just add on to that. First of all, again, killed it, Rodrigo. Adding on to Daniel, like I gotta say, I did share like this suspicion, like is the problem just one of recognition? And more like this question of action, right? Like what can we do, right? Just plainly. But I want to like introduce this theme in relation to recognition, that of construction, which is certainly a thematic for the uncanny. I think Supanchit said you have to construct the uncanny, right? Dolar said, the contents of the uncanny are really not what's important. It's the very form of it, right? So again, it has to be constructed. And trying to be like generous to Rodrigo, especially in this collective work that he's doing, this is a construction, this like space itself, right? So more than that, like I think what Rodrigo's collective is really trying to do is, perhaps in a word, this question of action remains an open question. It's the construction itself that allows for this action to take place, which in itself is yet still indeterminate, but it has a form, right? So it's not totally indeterminate. But I guess just like I'm so interested in this collective, and to kind of, I really just want Rodrigo to talk more about it, honestly. But this does seem revolutionary, like as a construction in itself, and it's especially concerned with the poor. So I'm interested, like, what about this dispositif makes it especially adept at listening to poor people, or maybe just more generally, like how is it different than, I don't know, your run-of-the-mill clinic you would find on the Upper West Side here in New York or something. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Connor. That was actually a very good way of translating what we are trying to attempt. So in a way, you actually helped me to formalize something that we were actually trying to achieve there. So thank you for that. You helped me out. Yes, so there's something we do bet on, a certain openness, right? So it's an action that we don't necessarily know where it's going. You're absolutely right about that. We could fail miserably, right? But nonetheless, we're actually trying to do something about it. And yes, it's not so much about the content, but it's something about the form. And I think that the uncanny can help us formalize a certain dimension of psychoanalysis, which is productive when we're dealing with situations such as this, right? We're thinking about periphery and the center, right? If we transpose that to other like dimensions, right? Let's go worldwide, right? Where is the center? Where is the peripheries, right? Semi-peripheries of the world. So it brings us back to many different layers of this discussion. And I think that those are crucial elements just for us to take into consideration when we're dealing with material conditions. We're dealing with subjective suffering, and especially when those two elements seems to combine with one another. So in a way, I think that we try to be try to just to first of all just be open to what appears instead of just like knowing that we automatically know what we're doing. We're just doing the other way around, right? We just open the doors. Whatever comes, it will come. That's basically what we do, right? So instead of just like saying that we know what we're doing, we don't. But that does not mean that we do not share some crucial core elements, right? And the first of them, the first of those elements would be it's meant to translate the psychoanalytic tripod under different terms, right? It's because usually you see people where the problem of elitism appears in psychoanalysis, right? It's when money appears in such fashion that those who are actually, even if they're going through an analysis themselves, they don't find a means to become a psychoanalyst. They don't find a means to actually put themselves occupying that particular position, right? Why is that? Because it becomes just too expensive. So imagine that you're just going through the hardship of paying for your own analysis. You have the desire to become an analyst yourself, but you don't have the money to pay for supervision. You don't have like the money to pay for just going through a school, right? Or any sort of institution. How do we deal with that? And I think that the interesting element of this particular dispositive is that everybody who's actually participating in that dispositive already said that they are willing to be supervisors to anyone who wants to become a psychoanalyst, right? From the neighborhood, right? From the community. So in a way, this is already fascinating, right? Because it just it short circuits this element, which is already a very fascinating core element that we managed to achieve, right? But we don't necessarily try to reinvent the wheel. Those who wants to go through a psychoanalytic treatment, they will. So we find rooms to accommodate people here and there, wherever we can find rooms to actually have the sessions to take place. But we do most of the times there are structures that we can actually use. So that's good. Things are about to change because of the elections and so on and so forth. So a few contracts which were actually operating will expire soon, but that's a problem for another day. But we try to do that. But that's the thing. We're just trying to deal with elitism on many different elements of this practice, and we don't quite sure where is this going, but we don't presuppose that we do, right? And I think this is actually very productive in this way. And about the population, it has everything to do with the demands which appear there, right? So this project of people who got out of prison, it created itself right? It's just people who are just like, yeah, I could either go back to crime, but basically because I cannot find something else to do, there's no other alternative. The possibility of actually inventing a different future, through this process would be pretty amazing, right? If we can actually try to do something in the sense, it's pretty good. Is this what we're doing? Not necessarily, right? But this is something that they demanded out of the dispositive, right? And then people just volunteered to actually participate and organize it. So this is what I did. I said, there's a demand. Let's try to do something about it. Same thing goes for the trans community there. So a lot of like suffering related to sexuality, to transgender situations of violence. There are many different elements there as well. There's another dispositive which was formed because of this demand. Another one on psychosis, which was also another demand. And the last one has something to do with family, the more judicial elements concerning family and violence and kids and all the legal procedures when you're dealing with situations such as this, when a child's in risk, how to deal with that. So this is also something which appears. So in terms of the groups which are actually forming concerning suffering, those are the demands which already appear, right? But the discussions which we are actually doing down there, they're very vast. So we deal with racism, elitism, violence in many different shapes. The state, violence which comes from the state. So those are the discussions that we managed to introduce down there. Trauma, how do we deal with trauma, collective trauma, elements from this discussion as well are also something that we introduce and debated to the community. Most of the people who participate from the first meetings were from the general population of the community. More and more we see psychology students appearing here and there. We see people who are just invested in the discussion, which start to appear as well. So I think it's a very interesting, more organic kind of way of doing things. And this is basically how we're working. The collective itself, who organizes everything, is basically around, I don't know, 20 people, I would say, 18, 20 people. That's basically it, And yeah, this is something that we are actually trying to do, right? Thank you for the opportunity of just like going on and on about this positive. This is basically what we were trying to do. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have one other question from, is it Mara? Did you want to ask your question, or would you? No, I can do it. Mara asks, could you please speak more about the comic effects of the uncanny and how humor is itself a way to spare someone from a very strict superego? Can this be a way of dealing with indeterminacy?
That's a fascinating question. I really like that, Daniel. I would say that, yes, I think that it's a bit more complicated in terms of how this could go, right? But certainly there's a possibility of using comedy as a way to deal with that. But where do I find the risks of it, right? Operations of jouissance also participate here, right? So to what extent we are dealing with jouissance, and this could become rather quickly an experience of suffering or something of too muchness of this experience? When do we, or just another element that Supancic discusses very quickly, but should not, and I think that the question does not go or falls into that direction, right? But there is a certain maniacal laughter, right, as a defense mechanism. This is not what we are actually dealing with here. And it's much more about this more comical element, which can be transformative. And there's something about this question which I think it nails this possibility, right? There are a couple of risks here and there, but if we manage to construct something out of this uncanniness, we could perhaps deal with an alternative, right? And we could shift from this experience of suffering, this more tragic element, escape its horrors and find something which could be comical about it, and then deal with this on different terms. So there is a certain transformation which could take place here. A few risks here and there on how to do this, but I would say that, yeah, it's most definitely a possibility. And it's a very interesting one in a certain kind of way. Not that we should laugh of our miseries. It's certainly not the point. This bunch is certainly not saying that, or either Milan Dolar or even Zizek on the discussions that we try to present here. But there is a certain repositioning which could be laughable. And this is actually a very interesting way of just seeing this. If we go back to popular culture, and I know, Daniel, you really like that, let's go to a film, which for me is a very interesting one and cool one. It's about vampires. You know, What We Do in the Shadows. Taika Waititi's What We Do in the Shadows, right? I don't know. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting film. It's basically a group of vampires who are living together in a sort of kind of reality show. And yes, we're dealing with vampires. Nonetheless, instead of just being those terrifying creatures which are there and feeding on humans, it's because we can see, we can peek behind the curtains. We just realize how ridiculous they actually can be. You know, their lives are just in a way kind of pathetic and a bit sad, right? And we manage to laugh about what is going on because they're kind of relics, outdated relics that are living on a certain time, which are not their time anymore. And instead of being horrified by it, we can actually appreciate that in a certain kind of way, right? We can subsume them in a different manner. And this could be perhaps a way of using comedy to remedy something which could be uncanny. And I think this film perhaps taps into that, I would say. But that's a fascinating question for sure. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, I really liked your summary of Zupancic's argument on uncanny and comedy, and the distinctions that you made between desire and drive were interesting and helpful as well. Although, like, I feel it's very formalistic, which is good, but it does require almost like a diagram to discuss some of these distinctions. But yes, okay. So, any other final questions for our friend Rodrigo? Rodrigo, this has been a really delightful seminar. And by the way, are you still doing the work in the favelas now, or has that concluded? Is it still going on?
You mean the PhD with them?
Like, yeah, do you still visit there or do any work at all? Or was this something you formally did?
Wait, sorry, Daniel. Which work? With the Slovenians?
No, with the favela work in the, yeah.
Oh, in the favela.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. No, it's sorry. Yeah. Because we were talking about the Slovenians and I thought we were talking about the yeah, sorry, I misheard you. Yes, the work in the favela is going on right now, still taking place. It's, I mean, it's 7 months out, but we're still going with it. In a way, it feels very recent, right? It feels very fresh. We're still even trying to understand how this will work. It's getting more and more traction, which I think is good, right? But they're open symposiums or open presentations to people, right? They take monthly cycles, right? So every month there's like this open day to introduce the dispositive to everybody who wants to join us, and a lecture from someone who we invite to participate. But all the other activities occur like any other type of institution, right? So it works, right? But yeah, it's a work which is still going. We're still trying to make it work. Let's go with that.
Nice. Okay. Thank you so much. This has been very fascinating. I personally gained a lot from the readings and from your lectures. And I know that the community we have developed will also benefit from this quite a lot as well. So just want to invite anyone else that they can feel free to jump in. If not, we're happy to close for now and invite Rodrigo back for some future stuff, maybe even like a podcast conversation, something along those lines would be good. Or maybe we should reach out to, I'm thinking about reaching out to like one of those Slovene thinkers to bring them onto the podcast so we can do like a kind of one-on-one. We had a huge event on Zizek recently. I don't know if you saw that, which was quite a lot of sparks flew for that event. But this has been great, my friend. Thank you so much. Any final words you'd like to leave us with?
I just wanted to thank you all. Thank you, Daniel, especially for your invitation. I mean, we've known each other for almost a decade now, which is amazing. So it feels great just to have this conversation once again. So thank you. I would love to participate in future endeavors, of course. If there's any conversations of opportunities, just count me in. I'll be there for sure. Thank you so very much for everyone who could join us. It's great to see everybody who's there. Connor, Maida, thank you so very much for being here. And that's it. It was a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Okay, everyone. Thanks again.